Hi, this is Douglas Robinson, and in this video we are going to be exploring how to sign into the Cherwell REST API. And since Cherwell has a call to web service action in their one-step editor, we're going to be using Cherwell to connect to Cherwell via the API. Now on the left side of my screen here I have the Swagger UI Cherwell REST API documentation site. On the right side I have my Cherwell client. So here I'm going to create a one-step so that we can sign in, and this one-step is going to be labeled Cherwell REST API test. I guess we can just call this token request. And here my action simply needs to be a call a web service action. I'm going to label it Authenticate because that's what it's going to do. We're going to connect to, I have a Cherwell v9.3 service. And then for login parameters, for body, this part's actually kind of interesting. So if you look in the Swagger UI page, it's kind of difficult to figure out what you need to send for your parameters because there's a couple of different options. And realistically, so we don't need site name because you're not signing into the portal, although it's interesting that you can technically sign in using a portal account. I've never done that, but food for thought. Our auth mode in this case is going to be internal, so we're not really going to specify this since it's optional. So that one's not going to get included. We're not using a refresh token. We do have a username and password, and we don't have a client secret. I actually don't believe this one is used for anything that we're using in the REST API. So that leaves us with grant type, client ID, username, and password. So for my body, we are going to type out username equals csdadmin, and then an ampersand. So this is going to get sent out as form URL encoded data. We don't have a way to process form URL encoded data in Cherwell. We can make them query string parameters, but we're just going to manually create the body content for this. So I'll look at how, actually, yeah, we'll do that right now. We'll look at how this web service call is actually defined. It's going to our local host and then Cherwell API for the URL. We have one login method, and the endpoint on it is token. So you'll notice what that does. We have localhost Cherwell API /token for this endpoint. And then there's two headers here. One of them is titled body. You'll notice it's marked as is content. So that means anything that we assign to this variable or this parameter, that will be the entire body content of this REST web service request, which is important. And then in this case we have content type, which is a header parameter. So that's how we've defined this web service method. So for our body content, we're going to be manually piecing together the form URL encoded data. And the way that the format for that is, you've got a key and a value, and then they're separated by an ampersand. So there you go. So we've got username, which is csdadmin, ampersand, password, also csdadmin on this system, ampersand, grant type equals password, and then ampersand, and at this point we need our client ID. So I'm going to sign into the system that I had that set up on, and we've got a test API client that we've created. If you don't know how to get here, it is something you have to define. So you go to your security or configure, you go to your security page, you click on REST API client settings, and then you create a new one if you don't have one. And when you create one, you give it a name. Let me see. You make sure that API access is enabled is checked, and then you give it a client key, or you copy this client key because I think it's automatically generated. Now make note of token lifespan because this key or the token that's generated does expire after a while. So it may take a while, or if your one-steps and processes that use this don't refresh, then they may actually run into authentication issues if this expires. So next we have our client ID equals this. And before I go forward, I just want to say, you can look at a lot of other examples of how this API is being used in other tools, and I think curl or PowerShell, for example, instead of using an ampersand as a separator, they use this use like a semicolon or something. So it really depends. I know if you're just sending it as flat, like REST content, then you need an ampersand. Like if you look at this in Postman or Fiddler or any of those tools that inspects the request, you want this to show up as an ampersand in the body content for that separator. Otherwise, you'll get back an error that says, client ID wasn't sent. And that's a common, I guess, error message that you can use to diagnose that you didn't separate your data properly in that case. I know this because I was running into that issue as I was preparing for this video. Okay, so we've got our body content, and it's got all this junk on it. We've got our content type, which I typed out as application x www form URL encoded, and then next what we're going to do is we're going to show a pop-up with the results. So our results from this one step are the call a web service result variable. Now that's going to be the body content of the result, and then there's also a return code and headers for the result message. I'm going to set this to text box so that we get a nice selectable text box, and then I'm going to run it. It may take a moment to actually run. Alright, so our response here is a result code of 200, which is your HTTP code for OK. Here are our headers, and then here's the response. So this is the response we're looking for. You have a JSON object with an access token in it. Now this is important. So if I open up Notepad++, oh, I don't think I have Notepad++ on my VM. That's very unfortunate. I'll have to correct that before our next video. Anyways, if I open up Notepad++, we can see we have this really long access token. I'm just going to break this out. There's a token type, which is bearer. As far as I've seen, with REST API tokens, token type is almost always a bearer token. I haven't seen an OAuth implementation that doesn't use bearer tokens. So in the case of Cherwell, token type is pretty much always going to be bearer unless I'm missing something. Okay, so here's our different values here, and I'm arranging them this way because this is a JSON object, and you can just pull these data points out directly using a JSON. You can pull them out directly using a JSON modifier. So, for example, we're going to assign some variables here. And before I actually assign anything to this, I'm going to go back to my call a web service result. And here we've got, where is it? So our login method has a data type. This is important. So if I set my data type to JSON, it's going to expect JSON results. If you set it to text, it's going to expect text results and other certain modifiers. When you work on that variable, it uses this result type directly. So this will actually control which modifiers you have access to when you work on that. I like text. Text is a really good option if you don't know what the data type is going to be, because you can get to the JSON modifier or the XML modifier set from a text data type, which is really convenient. But because I know what data type this is, I'm going to set it to JSON. Now here we are going to establish a variable for our access token. And this one will be text because we're just pulling out this very long string of text right here. We don't need the JSON around it. We just want that value. And to get to it, by the way, this is a handy, very handy little brief on how to use JSON modifiers. To get to it, we're going to reference the call a web service result. We're going to add a modifier to it. Now this modifier is going to be find object. We want actually it's going to be a string from element. String from element access token. And I'm not sure whether or not this is capitalized or not, or case sensitive, But that's all we should need to do to get our access token value. And if I put this in the call a web service, or if I put this in our pop-up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the beginning of this. We're going to say access token equals this variable. And then this way we can test how this is working, piece by piece. So you can see here my access token was stripped out perfectly. So that's our Json modifier for accessing the access token. That's great. There's some other information in here that we can pull out as well. And the way that we do that's going to be very, very similar. And we don't necessarily need a variable for it. I always get into the habit of putting it into a variable, because if you have to constantly, let's say you've got 100 objects in your JSON, if you have to repeatedly reference the call to web service result and then add modifiers to it every time you want to use it, you might drive yourself nuts. So I like to put stuff into variables, because then you can reuse it when you're assigning values using that data. Anyways, so here's our access token. And the other values we can pull out are token type. Token type's important. I don't know if we're going to cover it in this video, but later on, when you go to use the REST API service and you include the access token as your authorization header so that you can authenticate in your future REST API requests, you have to precede it with the word bearer. Absolutely have to. You can't just send the access token. It will say it's wrong. It will have to be bearer, space, and then the access token, which is kind of important. This is some interesting information here. So you've got expires in, which I believe is the amount of time, possibly in seconds? Yeah, that looks like seconds, that it'll take before this expires. And I believe you also have dot expires as a date and time value in a GMT time zone, supposedly. In which this will actually expire. You've got the issued time as well, which is great. You can see that there's 20 minutes apart between those. Username is actually sent back, which is interesting. And then you have a refresh token, which I believe you can send back to the client to get a new token so that you can refresh it and keep it from expiring. These two I don't think you'd really use for anything unless you needed to send back the refresh token. But yeah, that's it. If you needed to store when this expires, you could do the same thing here as access token and just do a string from element on the same call web service result. We're not going to cover any of the rest of that, because I think the only things you're really going to use here in this method are going to be the access token. When we get into some other stuff in the Cherwell REST API, we might cover, here's how you process all of this data that's returned by the API in XML format or JSON, because there are a lot of different API methods that'll cover that. But for now, this has been how you sign into Cherwell's REST API and retrieve an access token. If you'd like to see other videos like this one, feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can leave comments in the comment section below. You can email us. You can check out our website. Thanks.